Jill Sanders moved to the new vintage apartments in downtown Oklahoma City, hoping to start a new life far from the bitter memories of the past that still haunted her. As a young journalist and YouTuber, Jill wanted to immerse herself in the busy city life after a painful breakup that left deep scars. In her old apartment, every corner held memories of her former lover, adding to the burden she was eager to let go of. With new hopes, Jill tried to focus on her work, channeling all her energy into building her career as a journalist and content creator. However, as she began to settle into her seemingly luxurious new apartment, Jill was unaware of the unsettling silence lurking behind its modern walls. On her first night there, she felt uneasy, disturbed by faint sounds like soft whispers swirling in the room, disrupting the peace she longed for. Jill tried to ignore it, dismissing it as the effect of a tiring day, and eventually fell asleep. But just before drifting off, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a dark shadow moving quickly at the edge of her bed. Almost every night that shadow would return, though Jill had not yet fully grasped its presence. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew louder, tearing at Jill's peace with terrifying intensity. What once sounded like faint murmurs now became hysterical laughter or heartbreaking cries, echoing within the walls of her apartment, which seemed to grow smaller every day. Each night, Jill woke up with her heart racing, trapped in fear and confusion, desperately trying to make sense of the words that teased her senses, but always disappeared just as they came close. Footsteps echoed in the hallways, but whenever Jill opened the door to check, there was no one there. The steps had a rhythm, almost like they were in sync with her racing heartbeat, often ending with the sound of a creaking door, even though all the doors remained tightly locked. Curiosity mixed with fear pushed her journalistic instincts to search for answers. Jill finally reached out to Naomi, a resident on the same floor who had lived in the apartment building for over 5 years. They had met in the elevator while returning from work. Naomi's cheerful expression quickly turned somber when Jill began to talk about her experiences. Naomi looked at her with a gaze that seemed to hold a dark secret. In a low voice, Naomi confessed that she, too, had sensed strange things when she first moved into the apartment. The whispers and unseen footsteps had become a part of her daily life until she decided to ignore them. But even though Naomi tried to get used to it, the fear never really went away, like a shadow always lurking at the corner of her eye, ready to strike when she let her guard down. Jill felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, realizing that what she was going through was far more terrifying than what Naomi had imagined. After sharing their stories, Naomi suggested that they meet Alaya, a local resident known as a part-time ghost tour guide. She lived on the outskirts of the city. Alaya was well known among the locals for her knowledge of the urban legends that haunted the town. She lived in a rundown building not far from their apartment, a small house that seemed almost forgotten by time. When Jill and Naomi arrived at Alaya's house, they immediately felt something unusual. The old wooden door creaked as they pushed it open, leading them into a dim and gloomy living room. A faint light from a small lamp hanging from the ceiling cast strange shadows dancing on the walls. The living room was filled with dusty antique furniture, a faded, worn carpet, and wooden shelves packed with peculiar items, small statues, glass bottles filled with unknown liquids, and old photographs whose eyes seemed to follow their every move. An unusual scent filled the air, a mix of rotting wood, long extinguished candles, and something else, something more magical and mysterious, as if the room itself held secrets that could not be revealed. Despite the oppressive and eerie atmosphere creeping around them, Jill and Naomi tried to remain calm. They sat carefully on an old, creaky sofa, trying to suppress the fear crawling up their spines. Alaya, with a calm yet slightly mysterious demeanor, welcomed them and agreed to share her knowledge about the apartment where Jill and Naomi lived. The apartment was built over an old subway line, Alaya said in a low, meaningful voice, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It has long been abandoned, but its story remains, whispering in every dark corner. Some say the spirits of those who died during the construction of that line still wander these streets, seeking solace or perhaps looking for new victims. Her voice seemed to vibrate through the air, making the atmosphere even more tense. As Alaya spoke, Jill felt a cold, suffocating chill, as if the room was closing in on them. The living room, which already felt strange, now became far more terrifying, as if the shadows on the walls were not just ordinary shadows, but something alive, watching and waiting. After meeting with Alaya, Jill's curiosity grew even stronger. Driven by her fearless journalistic instincts, she began digging through city archives, uncovering hidden layers of history about the once bustling subway line, which had eventually been shut down after a series of tragic accidents. It was said that the workers who lost their lives in those tragedies now roamed as ghosts, seeking revenge, or perhaps simply searching for peace they never found. Some people believe these restless spirits still haunted the surrounding buildings, including the apartment where Jill lived. Each night, the shadows in her apartment seemed to grow darker, and the faint whispers turned into louder screams, unsettling her mind. Driven by a desire to find the truth, Jill gathered her courage and headed to the entrance of the long-abandoned subway line, where crumbling stones and rusted metal hid the dark secrets of the past. With a flashlight trembling in her hand and a notebook tightly clutched in her grip, she began descending the creaky stairs leading into the silent tunnel. Every step she took seemed to echo deep into the darkness, and the sound of water dripping from the tunnel ceiling added to the eerie atmosphere. Inside the underground tunnel, the air felt thick with a sense of nostalgia and piercing sadness. The beam of Jill's flashlight flickered as she walked deeper, making the shadows on the walls appear to move as if they were alive. The tension grew as the darkness closed in around her, and the shadows slowly merged into more distinct shapes. Faintly, pale faces emerged from the darkness, a young man in tattered clothes, a worker covered in dust, their eyes filled with desperation, as if pleading to be heard. Fear gripped Jill's heart, causing her breath to catch, but she refused to turn back. Her steps grew heavier as she moved deeper, closer to the source of the mysteries haunting her mind. She felt an unnatural cold, as if something was breathing behind her, but when she turned around, there was only darkness surrounding her. With trembling hands, Jill took out her voice recorder, trying to capture every whisper, every story the spirits wanted to share. The darkness grew thicker, and in the deafening silence, Jill knew she was not alone in the tunnel. Something, or someone, perhaps many, was watching her. "What are you looking for?" Jill whispered, her voice trembling and almost lost in the cold silence of the tunnel. Some force compelled her to remain standing before the group of shadows, which seemed to grow clearer and more terrifying. Jill was fully aware that she was facing entities feared by many, creatures that one would only dare imagine in nightmares. One of the shadows moved forward, taller than the others, with gleaming eyes that stared at Jill with a piercing gaze that seemed to cut to her very core. Instinctively, she began to step back, driven by the urge to survive, but the shadow kept advancing, staring at her with an intensity that nearly paralyzed her with fear. The flashlight slipped from her hand, falling and rolling across the floor, dimming the last light she had, making the shadows in front of her more indistinct, but even more frightening. The shadow continued to follow Jill until her back hit the cold, damp wall of the tunnel. There was no way out. Trapped, Jill could only feel her breath quickening, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, as if it were being squeezed. Suddenly, a sharp, pungent smell filled her nostrils, forcing her body to sway and weaken. Her vision began to blur, and she saw more and more shadows, faceless figures emerging from the darkness, as if made of thick, toxic mist. These figures surrounded her, staring with empty eyes filled with unspoken suffering. Fear gripped Jill, making her body tremble violently. Among the crowd of shadows, there was a figure with a half-burned face, as if reflecting pain from a past that could never be erased. Another figure had hands clawing at the air, trying to reach Jill, as if wanting to pull her into eternal darkness with them. She could hear silent screams in her ears, the voices of souls trapped in the tunnel, pleading, demanding, cursing. The noise grew louder, more chaotic, until Jill felt she was losing her mind. In the darkness that seemed to swallow her more and more, Jill knew she couldn't escape. A cold sensation began creeping over her body, as if the darkness was slowly seeping into her skin, making her feel empty and powerless. Before these shadows, Jill felt small and insignificant, and for a moment she experienced a fear so profound that it might never leave her. Jill was on the brink of losing consciousness. Her vision darkened. Only the sound of water dripping in the silence reached her ears. A slow, whispering sound could be heard, faint but clear in the quiet, saying, "Help me!" Jill fainted. When she came to, Jill's body felt crushed as if it had been weighed down by tons of rocks. Every joint ached, and her muscles felt like they were being pulled. With the last of her strength, she forced herself to stand and crawl out of the dark tunnel. Her steps were heavy and unsteady, but the urge to get away from that cursed place drove her forward. When she finally reached her apartment, she was breathless, cold sweat streaming down her forehead. But there was a burning determination inside her, a resolve to tell the stories of those who had been lost and forgotten. Jill decided to share her terrifying experience through her writing and content on her YouTube channel. She felt this was the only way to ensure that those who had lost their lives for progress would not be forgotten. With great passion, she began writing articles that depicted the humanity behind the steel structures and concrete walls now standing tall over past tragedies. With every article she published and every video she uploaded, it seemed to bring relief to the souls trapped in her apartment. The whispers that once filled her nights began to fade, and the shadows that often passed in the corners of her eyes slowly disappeared. Over time, peace started to return to her life, and her fame as a journalist and content creator soared. Her colleagues began to talk about her success, as did her neighbors. Naomi, who had sensed the same strange occurrences from the beginning, couldn't contain her curiosity after watching one of Jill's latest YouTube videos. Naomi then asked Jill to return to the underground tunnel. Although reluctant and filled with fear, Jill eventually agreed. There was something unfinished down there, something waiting to be uncovered, and this time she would not face the darkness alone. On a quiet night, with a light drizzle falling and wetting the streets, Jill and Naomi descended into the underground tunnel, which now felt more terrifying than ever before. Each drop of water hitting the old stones echoed, adding to the oppressive silence around them. A mystical aura enveloped the tunnel, and an uneasy feeling began to creep over Jill's skin, making her hair stand on end. Something was different this time, something darker, more threatening. Jill felt a cold chill with every step they took deeper. Naomi, usually calm and composed, now seemed quieter and more anxious. Jill could sense the tension between them, as if Naomi was holding back something important but was hesitant to reveal it. As they ventured further into the tunnel, the atmosphere became increasingly hostile. Jill's flashlight flickered, its beam reflecting off the damp, slimy walls, casting strange shadows that moved with their steps. The fear that had once been a vague feeling now felt real and gripping. Every time Jill glanced back, she could see Naomi avoiding her gaze, as if hiding a deeper fear. And suddenly, in front of them, the dark shadows reappeared. This time, they were no longer just fleeting in the corners of their eyes. They stood tall, more distinct and more terrifying, as if waiting for Jill and Naomi's arrival. The once blurred faces now appeared angry, with eyes glowing red in the darkness. One of the shadows, larger than the others, stepped forward toward Naomi. An aura of hostility radiated from it, making the air around them heavier and more suffocating. Naomi took a sharp breath but remained silent, staring at the shadow with an unreadable expression. Jill felt her body stiffen, unable to move, trapped in a feeling of fear that consumed her. The shadow moved closer, and Jill felt a coldness enveloping her, as if caught in an endless darkness. Just before everything became blurred, Jill saw the shadow reach out its hand toward Naomi, as if wanting to pull her into eternal darkness. Naomi remained silent and still, while Jill felt herself being drawn deeper into the thickening darkness, until the world around her vanished, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and a deepening sense of fear. Through the dimness, Jill saw Naomi's lips moving as if she was silently speaking. More shadows gathered around Naomi, who stood firmly as if challenging them. The sounds were no longer whispers but groans, clear and loud. The shadows swirled together, forming a thick, dark cloud. Jill couldn't see Naomi hidden behind the dark cloud. She heard Naomi scream before she finally collapsed, unconscious. The shadows continued to grow in number and density, surrounding Naomi, who remained standing as if defying the darkness pressing in on them. The groans, which had once been mere whispers, now turned into sharp, piercing cries, deafening, making Jill hold her breath in the midst of the terror. The shadows gathered, forming a thick, dark cloud that spun around Naomi, as if swallowing all light and hope. Jill tried to step forward, wanting to pull Naomi out of the circle of shadows, but her body felt heavy and stiff, as if an invisible force was holding her in place. Her breath caught as her vision was blocked by the dark cloud growing thicker, completely covering Naomi. In the middle of the darkness, Jill heard Naomi's voice, a desperate scream that echoed throughout the tunnel, shaking every wall and bouncing back into Jill's ears with a crushing force. The scream ended abruptly, cut off by a deadly silence, followed by the sound of Naomi's body collapsing onto the cold, wet tunnel floor. Jill could not see Naomi, completely hidden by the dark cloud that now seemed to press and advance toward her. The fear gripping Jill turned into panic, and she tried to crawl toward the place where she had last seen Naomi. However, the shadows seemed alive, blocking her every move, as if they didn't want to let Jill get closer. With the remaining strength she had, Jill called out for Naomi, but there was no answer. The silence of the tunnel took over again, leaving only the rustling of shadows moving around her. Naomi lay motionless, her body appearing small and helpless in the darkness that dominated the tunnel. Jill felt an overwhelming fear, afraid of losing her friend in this darkness, afraid of what might happen next. But she knew she couldn't leave Naomi here alone. Whatever it took, she had to save her. Jill managed to get Naomi to the hospital with great difficulty, her body trembling violently from the tension that still hadn't subsided. On the way, it felt as if the shadows from the tunnel were still chasing her, hiding in the dark corners of Jill's mind, making every second feel like torture. As Naomi was laid on the hospital bed, Jill waited anxiously outside the examination room, her heart pounding, filled with questions that wouldn't stop haunting her. When the doctor came out, his face looked serious. "Naomi is experiencing severe psychological trauma," he said, his voice calm but full of concern. "She's having trouble speaking, as if something is blocking her memory." Jill felt her chest tightening. Trauma? What really happened in that tunnel? Why was Naomi so deeply affected? These questions kept spinning in her mind. Naomi now lay weak, her gaze empty, and her lips trembled as if trying to say something unheard. As time went by, Jill's anxiety grew stronger. There had been something strange from the very start of their journey into the tunnel, a feeling she hadn't experienced before when she went there alone. This time, the darkness felt thicker, the cold more piercing, and the whispers seemed more real, more deadly. What was really going on? Jill recalled the moment they arrived at the tunnel, Naomi suddenly becoming distant, her expression stiff. The strangest thing was her mouth constantly moving as if reciting something Jill could not hear. Did Naomi know something that Jill didn't? Had Naomi done something deliberately to provoke the dark forces in that tunnel? These thoughts tore at Jill's peace of mind. Was Naomi somehow connected to those shadows? Jill tried to find an explanation, but everything felt unclear and frightening. She knew that whatever the answer was, the truth lay in that tunnel, and she would have to return there to find it, with or without Naomi. When Jill turned to look at Naomi again, her friend was still lying helpless in the hospital bed, her eyes blank. Yet, for a moment, Jill thought she saw something strange in Naomi's eyes, a faint glimmer that sent a shiver down her spine. Jill swallowed hard, a sense of fear beginning to grip her heart. The courage she once had now felt fragile, but she knew there were more secrets to uncover, and the same curiosity that had led her to the tunnel the first time was now driving her to go back. But the question was she ready to face whatever was waiting there? The typical hustle and bustle of a hospital greeted Jill as she made her way to Naomi's room. The sound of hurried footsteps, the constant hum of machines, and the sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air. Every second felt like an eternity, and each step was a mix of hope and worry. Jill was eager to hear the latest news about Naomi, whom she had visited several times without ever truly understanding what had happened on that troubling night. Her YouTube videos were filled with curious comments from viewers and subscribers, further fueling her curiosity. As Jill was nearing Naomi's room, she crossed paths with a man wearing a hospital staff uniform. He walked out of Naomi's room briskly, appearing to be in a hurry. Jill offered a friendly smile, hoping he might share some good news. However, the man returned her smile with a look that was difficult to describe, a deep, somewhat unsettling gaze, as if something remained unspoken. Jill quickly glanced at the name tag on his chest, James Baker. With her heart pounding, she continued toward Naomi's room, hoping her friend's condition had improved. The moment Jill entered Naomi's room, she was met with a sight that made her heart race. Naomi lay motionless, her face pale, while the heart monitor showed a weakening, flat line. Jill felt her breath catch, her chest tightening as she gasped on the brink of panic. Her eyes widened, and her body trembled as she saw Naomi's condition rapidly deteriorate. With panic-filled reflexes, Jill pressed the emergency button on the wall of the room, her voice tense as she shouted for help. "Please, hurry," she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. Doctors and nurses rushed in, their footsteps quick and urgent. Their faces were serious and focused. The doctor immediately began medical procedures, adjusting the equipment and giving instructions in a firm but calm tone. The sound of machines beeping and their hurried movements seemed to create a symphony of noise that made the situation even more tense. Jill stood outside the room, her body feeling stiff and powerless. She paced back and forth anxiously, each second dragging on. She was impatient to hear news from inside about Naomi's condition. Her heart felt heavy, surrounded by an overwhelming sense of guilt. Even though it had been Naomi's idea to enter the underground tunnel that night, the guilt continued to haunt her. Jill felt as if she were responsible for everything that had happened to her friend. Naomi regained consciousness, though her condition was still very weak. Jill was allowed to see her, but only for a short while. Naomi lay there, her body limp and her face pale. An oxygen tube was inserted in her nose, making it seem as though each breath she took was precious. Jill stood beside the bed, her eyes filled with deep sadness and pain, unable to do anything but look at Naomi with a vacant stare. Seeing Naomi, who used to be so full of life, now so helpless, made Jill feel as if all her mistakes were laid bare before her. Jill left the hospital. On her way home, her mind was filled with a flood of unanswered questions and worries. Suddenly, she remembered Aliyah. The name flashed in her mind like lightning in a dark night. Without a second thought, Jill turned her car toward Aliyah's house on the outskirts of town, even though the night was already wrapped in darkness. When Jill arrived in front of Aliyah's house, She felt a different atmosphere compared to her first visit with Naomi a few days ago. The old house stood in the darkness of the night, surrounded by a thin mist that added a sense of mystery. The dim moonlight reflected off the dirty windows, casting eerie shadows on the outer walls. The narrow path leading to the door was filled with strange objects that looked like remnants of ancient rituals, odd statues, nearly burned out candles, and mysterious symbols carved into the walls. Every object seemed to radiate a dark and frightening aura. Jill had seen them before, but that time she and Naomi had come during the afternoon, and the atmosphere felt very different. Jill felt a chill touch her skin as she moved closer to the door, as if something was lurking in the darkness. Her heart pounded, echoing with every step she took towards the entrance. The house seemed to be waiting, ready to reveal secrets long hidden. The dark night and the mystical aura of Alaya's house added to her tension, making her feel as if she were stepping into another world full of mystery and danger. As she reached the front of Alaya's house, the atmosphere that greeted Jill was deeply unsettling. She looked around once more. The old house stood apart from the others, surrounded by large trees that bent over as if trying to hide it from view. A thin night fog floated around, creating a frighteningly magical ambience. Jill knocked several times, but only silence answered her. Her heart raced as she realized the door to Alaya's house was unlocked, slightly ajar, almost as if inviting her to enter. With slow steps and a racing heart, Jill gathered the courage to push the old wooden door open. The door creaked softly, greeting her with a tense sound. As she stepped inside, a strange smell hit her nose, a mix of stale spices and something sharper, like an odor that had been trapped in the room for a long time. Jill turned on the flashlight on her phone, the small beam trembling in her hand as she illuminated the dim room. "Hello," she whispered, her voice sounding small and hesitant in the darkness. In the faint light of the flashlight, the room was filled with strange and mysterious objects. Dark, eerie wooden statues were scattered around, as if staring at her with an empty and frightening gaze. Half-burned candles and ancient symbols randomly carved on the walls added to the mystical atmosphere. The objects were disorganized, almost chaotic, creating a tense aura. Each step Jill took inside the house felt like stepping into another world, where everything hid in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. Goosebumps rose on her skin, and a mix of wonder and fear filled her mind. Jill felt as though she had entered a dimension full of dark secrets. After confirming that Alaya was not at home, Jill decided to leave. The mystical aura hanging over the house made it unbearable for her to stay there any longer. The gloomy and mysterious atmosphere that haunted every corner of Alaya's house made her heart race, and she felt deeply uneasy. The night was already getting late. Filled with a sense of confusion, Jill returned to her apartment. She resolved to investigate the strangeness further the next night, back in the tunnel. When she arrived at her apartment, Jill walked through the quiet, empty lobby, a place that always made her feel isolated, even though the building was quite luxurious. The security guard on duty only greeted her with a brief smile and a simple hello, adding to the coldness and distance, far from any warmth. Jill felt a stark contrast between the atmosphere in the lobby and her usual daily hustle and bustle. As she entered the elevator, Jill felt even more uneasy. The elevator moved slowly, as if adding to the emotional weight on her shoulders. When she reached her apartment unit, she opened the door feeling incredibly tired. However, as she entered her apartment, Jill sensed something strange, a different aura that filled the room. There was something she couldn't quite explain, a subtle yet distinct change compared to the previous nights. Exhaustion had overtaken her entire body, making her long for rest. She hurried to the bathroom, hoping that a shower might help release some of the emotional and physical burden that had built up. However, as she entered the bathroom, strange things began to happen. The water suddenly stopped, and the bathroom light dimmed slowly until it finally went out completely. leaving her in suffocating darkness. Only the emergency light remained on, casting a faint, insufficient glow. In a panic, Jill rushed to the window to check if the power outage affected the entire building. Strangely, the apartments in the other tower were still brightly lit, in stark contrast to the darkness surrounding hers. Hastily, Jill went to the door and opened it to look down the hallway, which was also shrouded in pitch blackness. Fear and uncertainty gripped her, prompting her to quickly shut the door. Jill didn't want to connect this odd occurrence with what had happened to Naomi or with the investigation she was conducting in the subway tunnel. The fatigue that permeated her body made her feel even more overwhelmed. All the strange events she had experienced, combined with the darkness engulfing her apartment, made her want to forget everything and focus on just one thing: sleep. Jill felt an intense weariness. Using all the strength she had left, she lay down on her bed, hoping to forget everything under the comfort of her blanket. Jill found herself walking down a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Thick white smoke swirled around her, enveloping her in a layer of mystery. The walls of the corridor looked damp and wet, exuding a foul smell that clung to her nose, as if every second reminded her of something deeply unwanted. In this grim twilight, an immense fear crept over her, making each step feel heavier and more painful. Gradually, the thick smoke surrounding her began to form terrifying shapes. Dark shadows emerged from the white mist, figures that resembled ghosts from a nightmare, eyes glowing red, piercing through the darkness, and pale faces with empty, haunting expressions. They moved slowly, floating in the air with long arms reaching out toward Jill, as if they wanted to pull her into the inevitable darkness. Each movement of the figures felt like a cold grip drawing nearer. Jill felt increasingly cornered, as if the narrow hallway was closing in, trapping her in a state of rising panic. Her breath was short and gasping, barely able to escape her nose and throat, which felt choked. An indistinct rumbling sound came from all directions, adding to the suffocating tension. In deep confusion and fear, she tried to hold herself together as best as she could, struggling in the darkness. The terrifying figures moved closer, their thin, lightly haired hands groping the air as if ready to grab and pull her into the threatening abyss of darkness. Broken cries escaped from Jill's mouth, screams of intense fear from her nightmare. "No!" she screamed with all her might, hoping to drive away the creatures. Her loud, panicked scream woke her up. Her breath was heavy, and her body was drenched in cold sweat. The darkness of her apartment room felt even more frightening after that nightmare. She turned to the digital clock on the nightstand beside her bed. The clock showed 4:30 a.m. The realization that the night was still long and the tension from the nightmare kept her wide awake, trapped between reality and the lingering fear in her mind. She couldn't continue the sleep that had only lasted a few hours. Jill walked over to the desk in the corner of her bedroom. Every step felt heavy, as if burdened by thoughts that constantly haunted her. Her mind was filled with fragments of events from the past 24 hours, as if her life had turned into an unsolvable dark puzzle. She tried hard to recall, piecing together the almost senseless details. Naomi suddenly dying in front of her, Alaya's house filled with a mystical and frightening aura, the strange occurrences in her apartment that seemed to challenge her to dig deeper, and the nightmare that had just shaken her soul. All of these seemed to merge in her mind, creating a web of mystery that tightened around her. With slightly trembling hands, Jill opened her journal, where she had been writing down everything that happened. Every word she wrote felt like a thread that connected the scattered pieces of the puzzle in her mind. Her fingers trembled as she began typing on her laptop, trying to piece together the strange events that led her to the old tunnel beneath the city, the tunnel that had now become the center of all her curiosity and fear. However, one thing kept haunting her mind, a detail that couldn't be easily ignored. The hospital staff member who left Naomi's room, James Baker. The expression on the man's face, his cold stare and unnatural smile, continued to torment her thoughts. Jill felt something was off, something not right. Driven by an urge she couldn't quite explain, she began searching for information about James Baker on the internet. She typed the name into a search engine, adding Oklahoma Hospital to narrow the results. However, no information appeared, as if the man was a shadow that had never existed. Jill took a deep breath, sensing there was something bigger behind all of this. Quickly, she typed a WhatsApp message to her contact in the police force, someone who could help her access more in-depth information. As a journalist, Jill had access that most people didn't, but this time, the urge to know more felt very personal, even urgent. There was something in James Baker's gaze that made it impossible for Jill to stay silent. Her curiosity and fear blended into one, making every second of waiting feel like a needle pricking her consciousness. The day grew darker as Jill once again descended the steep steps into the depths of the tunnel that seemed to hide dark secrets. This was her third time entering this place. Her fear had not diminished, in fact, it had only grown deeper. The atmosphere around her remained the same, cold and eerie, as if the tunnel was alive, watching her every step. Jill wore a headlamp on her forehead, a small beam of light that was just enough to penetrate the dense darkness swallowing every corner of the tunnel. Jill had no idea what answers she might find in this darkness, but something inside her pushed her to go further, to uncover the mystery that had been haunting her. She stood for a moment at the tunnel's entrance, feeling the cold air creeping into her bones, making her skin crawl. The terror was real, gripping, but Jill knew she couldn't turn back now. With slow and careful steps, she began to walk down the dark corridor, lit only by the headlamp. Every shadow created by the light seemed to dance on the wet walls, creating an illusion of movement that made Jill's heart beat faster. She could feel the tension in every breath, as if she were walking a thin line between the real world and an unseen one. Jill had decided not to bring a camera, even though her YouTube viewers and loyal subscribers had suggested she record this journey. Jill felt that a camera would only distract her from the important details that might provide clues. It would also limit her movements and cause her to lose focus. She wanted to write this story honestly, without any distractions, and experience every moment with full awareness. The deeper she went, the thicker the fear that surrounded her became. The wet walls of the tunnel seemed almost alive, absorbing the sound of her footsteps and replacing them with an echo that crept into her mind, even though there were no faint whispers like she had heard before. Jill's breathing grew rapid, but she couldn't stop. Curiosity and fear merged, pulling her further into the seemingly endless darkness. Every step seemed to bring Jill closer to something beyond explanation, something that made her heart beat faster, not because of fear, but because of a burning curiosity within her. This tunnel held secrets, and although she didn't know what she would find, Jill felt that the truth was very close, so close she could almost sense it. Jill's steps took her deeper into the tunnel, each footfall carrying her further into the dark and silent depths of the earth. A tense stillness hung in the air, so different from her previous experiences. There were no faint whispers or fleeting shadows like those she had encountered during her first visit or when she was with Naomi. It was as if the tunnel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. After following what seemed like an endless corridor, Jill reached a large room that suddenly opened before her. It appeared to be an old, abandoned subway station. Despite the darkness, Jill could still recognize remnants of the past. Shadows of rusty equipment and empty, dust-covered spaces added to the gloomy atmosphere. The station felt like a museum preserving memories of a forgotten era, yet the thick silence made it seem more like a tomb than a stopover. Jill looked around, observing every corner carefully. The darkness and shadows seemed to form strange patterns on the walls, intensifying her choking fear. Suddenly, her headlamp went out. Jill froze, fear quickly coursing through her veins. In the total darkness, she fumbled in her jacket pocket, searching for her phone to turn on its flashlight. But all she found was emptiness. Her phone was gone. She was sure she had it safely tucked in her jacket pocket. Could it have fallen in the car? Panic-stricken thoughts flashed through her mind, now flooded with adrenaline. The dense darkness made her lose her sense of direction. She couldn't see anything, not even her own shadow. As Jill prepared to step back, an unseen force suddenly struck her hard, throwing her body against an old table in one corner of the room. Pain quickly spread throughout her body, leaving her staggering and dazed. She couldn't see who or what had attacked her, but Jill knew one thing: she was not alone. Shapeless yet real dark figures began to cling to her body, pressing in from all directions. Her breath came in gasps, becoming harder to draw with every second. Jill struggled with all her strength, trying to break free from the unseen but powerful grip. She needed to move, needed to find a way out before it was too late. Though her body felt heavy as if bound by invisible chains, Jill forced herself to keep moving. But without light, it was futile. The room felt like a dark labyrinth, swallowing every attempt she made to escape. In her dwindling determination, Jill was thrown back onto the cold floor. This time, as she fell, her eyes caught a small flicker of light in the distance. That sudden glimpse of hope gave her new energy. Jill tried to stand, but her body could no longer support her. She finally crawled toward the light that seemed to be getting closer. The invisible hand still clutched at her, hindering her every move, but Jill kept fighting, trying to reach the light that had now become her only chance of salvation. Her strength was almost entirely drained. She could no longer fight or move. A sense of surrender crept in as her body lay helpless on the cold floor. The light grew brighter, approaching with an unnatural speed. In a state between consciousness and unconsciousness, Jill saw a figure behind the light. A face she recognized, though faint and obscured by the blinding light. It was Alaya. Jill still couldn't move, as if frozen at the entrance of the cold and silent tunnel. The sound of her rapid breathing echoed, lost in the gusts of wind that seemed to swirl inside the tunnel. The tunnel walls were damp, covered with moss and cracks, while the ceiling seemed to be crumbling, adding to the ominous atmosphere. The damp smell of earth mixed with a foul odor from an unknown source filled the air, making Jill's breathing even more labored. Just before the light, which turned out to be from Alaya, reached her, a large shadow appeared from nowhere and struck Alaya violently. Alaya's body slammed against the tunnel wall, accompanied by a heart-wrenching groan of pain. The small flashlight she was holding flew out of her hand, landing and vibrating on the cold stone floor, still lit but with its beam slowly fading. Jill could see everything dimly, the gloomy atmosphere growing more suffocating. Alaya struggled to stand, her face pale in the darkness, but no sound could be heard except the increasingly wild gusts of wind, like the whispers of formless spirits running about. The tunnel felt narrower. Shadowy figures floated at the far end of the room, drawing closer, towering like a moving curtain of darkness encircling Alaya. They moved silently, with only a chilling clink slicing through the roaring wind. Invisible hands began to creep up Jill's legs, gripping them tightly, as if trying to pull her back into the darkness. Jill struggled and writhed, but the more she fought, the stronger the grip became, draining the last remnants of her courage. The floating figures now gathered around Alaya, crowding her as if ready to consume her. Jill could hear Alaya's faint moans, as if choked in her throat. Alaya's breaths were ragged and labored, as if the air around her was being forcibly sucked from her lungs. The figures were now choking Alaya with their unseen hands, which were faintly visible by the way her body was cornered and pinned against the tunnel wall. In the dimming light, Jill saw Alaya's mouth moving, muttering something, but no sound came out except for the continuous hissing of the wind. like whispers in a language beyond understanding. Fear gripped Jill. Her chest felt as if it were being crushed. Even though her body was trembling violently, Jill tried to crawl closer to Alaya. Every inch of her movement felt like a struggle against an invisible force that kept pulling her back. The unseen hands tightened their grip around her ankles, as if trying to drag her into the dark shadows now surrounding Alaya. But Jill didn't give up. She knew that Alaya was her only hope, the only one who could save her from this nightmare. Though her heart was pounding and her breath came in terrified gasps, she crawled closer, trying to reach Alaya. Breathing heavily, Jill finally managed to get close to Alaya, who now appeared so weak. The shadowy figures around them moved wildly, stretching out their hands to keep them apart, but Jill continued to move forward with determination. Alaya, who was now suffering and almost out of strength, reached out her hand toward Jill, trying to touch her head with trembling fingers. When Alaya finally touched Jill, something unexpected happened. Alaya's thumb pressed firmly against Jill's forehead, and suddenly an intense pain struck Jill's head. The pain was so sharp, like a sledgehammer pounding mercilessly against her skull. Her head spun, and her vision blurred. The world around her seemed to swirl and press in, crushing everything inside her. The pain was so overwhelming that Jill staggered back. She shut her eyes tightly, trying to fight off the dizziness that intensified, as if she were being hurled into the center of a tornado. The shadows grew wilder, as if they were celebrating their suffering. Alaya's breathing became weaker. Amidst the sound of the wind and the shadows dancing on the tunnel walls, Jill felt her body sinking further into the darkness. Was this the end? Her eyes remained shut, but she could still sense Alaya struggling beside her. In her despair and unbearable pain, Jill knew only one thing. She had to get out of this terrifying situation. They had to survive, no matter what. But amidst the screams echoing in her head and the shadows tightening their grip, Jill forced herself to open her eyes with all the strength she had left. As Jill opened her eyes, something strange happened. The tunnel, which had been so dark, damp, and cold, now changed drastically. Lights from sources unknown, not from lamps or flashlights, filled every corner of the room. Jill could now clearly see the horror that had been hidden in the darkness. She felt as if she were in another world, a world inhabited by invisible beings. The shadowy figures, which could previously only be felt through a cold touch and the sound of hissing wind, now appeared right in front of her. They floated in the air, their bodies half transparent but revealing terrifying details. Their faces were imperfect. Some had no eyes, just dark hollows. Others had a single large eye that stared sharply, gazing at Jill with a look of hunger, full of hatred and revenge. Their mouths were filled with sharp, crooked fangs, emitting ear-piercing, screeching sounds. Other figures had only half bodies without legs, with cloth trailing to the ground. Their long, filthy, and slimy hands reached toward Jill. Their fingers, wrinkled and broken, seemed to grip her with a coldness that pierced to the bone. Jill was shocked to see them so clearly. These creatures were not just shadows. They were alive, here, and they wanted her. Jill blinked repeatedly, hoping this was just an illusion or a nightmare that would soon end. But every time she opened her eyes, the scene remained the same, growing even more frightening. The figures moved closer, surrounding her with an aura of despair, sending waves of indescribable fear. Terror coursed through her body, making every nerve shiver. She tried to move, but her arms and legs felt stiff, as if bound by a deepening fear. In the corner of the tunnel, Alaya stirred. Her weak body leaned against the tunnel wall, her breathing heavy and slow. Her eyes were tightly shut, but her lips continued to move, muttering words unfamiliar to Jill. The phrases sounded like a chant, incomprehensible but filled with power. Jill heard Alaya's voice echoing against the tunnel walls, each word triggering a reaction from the creatures surrounding them. Screams began to echo in the tunnel, the sound nearly piercing Jill's ears. The creatures were howling, long wails that made Jill's head throb with pain. "Leave us! Do not disturb us!" Their voices were deafening, hoarse, and filled with rage. Jill covered her ears, trying to block out the sounds, but it was in vain. Their screams kept pounding, as if shaking her soul. The hands that had been gripping her legs slowly began to weaken. The cold grasp finally loosened, freeing Jill's body, but the fear did not diminish in the slightest. The figures that had held her with such terrifying strength now retreated, moving away from Alaya, who was still muttering. They floated back with louder screams, as if tormented by the chant Alaya was reciting. However, even though the creatures were retreating, Jill knew something worse was happening. Her eyes were now open, not just in a physical sense, but also in a spiritual one. She could feel a mystical aura so thick that it seemed every molecule of air around her was filled with dark energy and a threatening supernatural force. Her body trembled not only from fear, but because she could now sense what had been hidden before, their presence, those creatures, so real and dangerous. Alaya, with her supernatural power, had opened Jill's inner vision. Now she could see and feel things that had been hidden from the eyes of ordinary people. This vision was not a gift, but a curse that trapped her in a cycle of fear she had never experienced before. Every shadow, every gust of wind now felt like a real threat, as if the very world itself wanted to swallow her alive. Jill looked at Alaya, who was still struggling with her chants. The shadowy figures seemed to be pushed back by Alaya's power, but Jill knew they wouldn't give up easily. Alaya, with her supernatural strength, might protect them for a while, but not forever. This tunnel was their home, and they would not let Jill and Alaya leave easily. "Alaya," Jill whispered with a trembling voice. "Let's go." But Alaya did not answer. Her eyes remained closed, and her mouth continued to mutter incomprehensible words. Her face was pale, sweat pouring down her forehead, her body trembling under the pressure of the evil force now surrounding them. Jill felt the gripping fear in her heart deepen. She knew that if Alaya failed, there would be no way out for them. Jill slowly managed to regain some control, even though her entire body was still covered in unbearable fear. The light around them began to flicker and dim, fading as Alaya's chanting grew weaker. Jill knew they didn't have much time left. The creatures began moving again, slowly approaching with deadly intent. Their hands stretched out, ready to drag Jill and Alaya into eternal darkness. Alaya remained motionless, as if absorbed in a world only she could understand. The soft voice from her lips continued to chant foreign phrases that echoed in the air, creating a strange aura around them. Her eyes stayed shut, but her face showed deep tension, her brow furrowed, sweat pouring down her cheeks, and her body seemed to tremble as if bearing a power too great to handle. Jill could feel the heat radiating from Alaya's body, making the atmosphere in the tunnel, already thick with terror, feel even more oppressive. Around them, the shadowy figures began to retreat. They floated with grimacing faces, eyeless with mouths wide open, emitting screams and hisses that pierced the ears. Their hideous black hands waved in the air as if trying to grasp, but they lost strength each time Alaya's chanting grew stronger. One by one, they fell back, driven away by the supernatural force radiating from Alaya. The screams that once echoed now softened, becoming faint whispers, slowly fading into an eerie silence. Jill watched with a mix of fear, awe, and wonder as the creatures dissolved like mist swept away by the wind. They disappeared, evaporating into the darkness, as if they had never existed. The light that had illuminated the room also faded along with the disappearance of the creatures, leaving only a small flashlight lying in the corner of the tunnel, emitting a faint light that was almost gone. The tunnel, once crowded with terrifying beings, was now silent, filled only with an oppressive stillness. Alaya opened her eyes. A blank yet deep stare emanated from her dark eyes. Jill felt something unspoken behind that gaze, something larger and darker than she could understand. Every inch of Jill's body tingled, the hair on her arms standing upright as if responding to the presence of an invisible energy. Alaya did not say a word. She gave only a weak nod before trying to stand. Jill, her body still trembling, gathered her remaining strength to help Alaya. They stood together in the suffocating silence, trying to leave the place as quickly as possible. Jill picked up the flashlight, still faintly glowing, and began to walk, her legs feeling heavy as if held back by the shadows that had just vanished. As they made their way out of the tunnel, Jill's mind was filled with horrifying flashes of what she had just experienced. The terrifying figures, the unheard screams, the oppressive heat, all were still swirling in her head, mixed with the fear that weighed heavily on her chest. But Jill refused to be trapped in that terror any longer. She just wanted to get out, to forget it all. Alaya, beside her, was still stumbling, her eyes vacant and lips tightly shut. At times Jill wanted to ask to know what had really happened. Who or what were those figures? Where did Alaya get the power to drive them away? But every time she tried to speak, fear held her back. Perhaps some secrets are not meant to be revealed. They finally reached the end of the tunnel. The dim light from outside greeted them, but relief did not come immediately. Jill's body felt battered, pain radiating through all her joints. Meanwhile, Alaya remained silent, holding on to countless untold secrets. Without a word, they left the tunnel. The journey back to Alaya's house was filled with a tense silence. Jill could only stay quiet, still wrestling with her chaotic thoughts. Every passing second felt like a never-ending nightmare. Occasionally, she glanced at Alaya, who sat quietly in the seat beside her, lips tightly closed as if holding back secrets too dark to share. The night grew deeper, with dark clouds hanging low over the garden in front of Alaya's house. The slow-blowing wind carried the scent of damp earth, making the atmosphere feel even heavier and more tense. Jill sat beside Alaya, leaning against the cold garden bench, her phone in hand, ready to record every word that would come from Alaya's mouth. The garden around them seemed calm, but Jill's heart was in turmoil, filled with curiosity mixed with anxiety. Alaya stared into the distance, her eyes vacant, as if lost in dark memories. With a hoarse and soft voice, she began to tell everything. Jill listened attentively. Each sentence from Alaya's lips felt like a thorn piercing her consciousness. "As I told you before," Alaya began, "your apartment and many other buildings in this city are built over old subway lines and stations that were shut down. Many tragic accidents happened there, leading the government to close down the tracks." Jill remained silent, her breath held. She knew a little about this story, but hearing it directly from Alaya made it feel more real, more frightening. "In recent years, many content creators," Alaya continued, "with all their antics, including Naomi and her friends, have disturbed the unseen residents of that place. They didn't just come to make content, but also did things they shouldn't have." Jill held her breath, listening intently to every word. In her mind, images of Naomi and what she might have done in that tunnel began to play, creating a picture that made Jill feel increasingly uneasy. "Naomi once came to me for help. She stopped being a content creator afterward because she was often disturbed, nightmares, the presence of creatures haunting her in her apartment. But something changed after that, Jill. And when you came with her to the tunnel, they felt anger. They recognized Naomi and saw you as a part of her." Every word from Alaya's mouth added to the weight on Jill's chest. She could feel the cold of the night creeping into her bones, not because of the air, but because of the fear gathering in her heart. Slowly, sadness and anger mixed within her, stirring her emotions. Why were people so reckless? Why did they never respect other beings, even those they couldn't see? Amid the night's silence, a notification from Jill's phone broke the atmosphere. With trembling hands, Jill picked up her phone and opened the newly arrived message. Her eyes locked on the screen, reading the words sent by Noel, her friend from the police department. Alaya looked at her with a questioning expression, but Jill couldn't speak. The message revealed a shocking fact. James Baker, the man Jill had seen leaving Naomi's hospital room, was a former hospital employee. He had died in 2013 in a train accident on the subway line. James was part of the past that haunted that place. Suddenly, Jill's body shook, fear coursing through her entire being. James Baker, the man she had clearly seen, was the restless spirit from that accident. A photo attached by Noel in the message confirmed everything. The man was indeed the same. A man who had been dead for a long time. Aliyah noticed the change in Jill's expression. "What is it?" she asked softly, but Jill just shook her head, too confused to explain. Just as Jill was about to put her phone back in her pocket, another message came through. The sound of the notification felt like a haunting bell in her mind. Her hands trembled as she opened the message. Suddenly it felt as if the world was collapsing around her. The message was from the hospital. Jill couldn't speak. Her body went limp, her lips quivered, and tears began to well up in her eyes. Aliyah, sitting beside her, grew more anxious. "Jill, what is it?" Jill's tears fell slowly, streaming down her cheeks. In a voice barely audible, Jill finally said, Naomi has passed away." The words cut through the night air like a sword, bringing an indescribable sorrow. Aliyah fell silent, trying to process the terrible news Jill had just shared. For a moment it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Jill lowered her head, her hands shaking as she tried to hold back the surge of emotions. The guilt, the loss, and the fear that had been buried in her heart finally exploded. Naomi, the friend she thought still had time to make things right, was now gone forever. Meanwhile, Aliyah looked up at the night sky with a deep, sorrowful gaze. Even though she had the power to communicate with the unseen, the sense of loss still pierced her heart. She knew that Naomi's spirit had now departed, leaving this world with all her mistakes unredeemed. In the stillness of the night, Jill and Aliyah could only remain silent, reflecting on Naomi's fate, trapped in a profound sense of regret.